Welcome to the Adulting Demystified podcast with your host, Odelia Goldberg. In each episode, we'll have subject matter experts discuss things that most people don't know, but probably should. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcast, Spotify, and on our website, ogoldberglaw.com. Now, here's the host of Adulting Demystified, Odelia Goldberg.
Hi, everyone. And hi, Giselle. Thank you so much for agreeing to do my podcast with me today.
Very excited to be here.
So, Giselle, you and I kind of touch based a little bit about what we're going to be talking about, which is domestic partnership here in Florida. And I know you have a little bit of a personal story to, kind of your personal experience to share with us. And then you and I can talk a little bit about the difference between a domestic partnership versus the traditional marriage and how Florida kind of see those two. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your experience with the term domestic partnership and what it's been like for you?
Yes. So having been married several times, I've chosen in my current relationship of over 11 years to not marry and develop a what we call a domestic partnership, whether some people call it a registered domestic partnership, where you can actually register it. I know that personally, I've registered it with the company that I work for. They asked us for that. Yeah. I'm not sure. Some people have told me that you can register it down at Dade County, which is the county that I live in. But it was very eye-opening to me. All of the myths around, well, it's just a common law marriage, which in the state of Florida does not exist.
That's exactly right.
So that opened up a whole can of worms and a whole new world for me, because as you say, the traditional married things, very easy to figure out. Your spouse shares your home, shares your assets, maybe shares your credit, shares perhaps, good credit, bad credit, bankruptcies, whatever, everything is entailed in an actual marriage, but not necessarily true in a domestic partnership.
Right.
So that the first myth was, no, as far as I have looked into, Florida does not have common law marriage.
Right. That's exactly right. Now, the idea would be that if somebody did come from a state that does recognize common law marriage, some of these states do, then they would conceivably could be considered common law married here in Florida too. So there is this notion that if you came from a place that had it, then potentially, your partner could, kind of raise that argument. But on its face in Florida, marriage is kind of like a light switch. It's either on or off. So we don't have a notion of common law marriage or this idea of legally separated, right? Either you're married because you got married and you got the license, or you're divorced or you've never been married. So that's kind of a very clear-cut and easy rule for us here in Florida. And then the second notion is that marriage is very meaningful. A lot of times people think, oh, look at us, we love each other, we're going to get married. Or, God has ordained our love. This is a religious situation. But when you get married with the state of Florida, you are inviting the state of Florida into your relationship. And the state of Florida has a lot to say. Namely, you can't disinherit your spouse. Not from your primary residence that's been homesteaded, and not from your estate. So if somebody is married legally and they have an estate, then their spouse is entitled to a third of the estate if the individual has a will. And if the individual doesn't have a will, then half of the estate. Now, you can disinherit your parents, your kids, your children, your neighbor, your friends, but you cannot disinherit your spouse. So it happens quite often that people call me looking for an estate plan, and really what they want is a prenuptial or postnuptial agreement, right? Because in my documents, I treat those married people as though they're one unit. I can't have a will or trust or any kind of document that would not kind of recognize their spouse. The only way to disinherit a spouse in Florida is with a prenuptial agreement or postnuptial agreement. And footnote, those agreements should be handled by a family attorney, because a transactional attorney like me that does estate planning, in my opinion, should not be drafting those prenups and postnups. Those should be drafted by the people that litigate them in family court, right?
Ah, good to know. That's very good to know, because I would not have made that distinction.
Yeah.
I would not have made that distinction. So my question is then, and these are the questions that have been posed to us as a couple over the last 11 years. How do we design a cohabitation agreement?
Right. Now, nothing stops two people from getting into an agreement together called a cohabitation agreement, or any type of agreement that would say, you can live here, I can live there. If we break up or if we no longer can stand each other, these are the terms of our arrangement. I sometimes put those agreements in a trust, right? Especially if we're talking about real property. So if we've got real property and we want to kind of encumber it through an agreement, a lot of times, not every time, depending on the circumstances, obviously, two people can come together and they can lock up the asset with the terms of the agreement. So the asset itself talks about, should this person want to sell and this person not, then they could buy each other out. Should we sell the property? Who gets the proceeds? Who gets reimbursed? Can we take out a mortgage? Is there a mortgage? Who has to pay the utilities? What happens if one of us should pass away, right? So the trust agreement can kind of govern all those circumstances within the agreement, talking about the asset itself. But outside of the trust agreement, we can also get into an agreement that says who pays what bills. And, a lot of this is uncomfortable and not sexy and not romantic, but it is very helpful, because people come into a relationship and they have misconceptions. Sometimes people think, oh, I'm going to do this, but he's going to do that. And they don't really talk about it or put it in writing. And at that point, that's when the, problems usually step in.
So would a cohabitation agreement be drawn up by the family lawyer and then incorporated into your trust agreement? Is that correct?
Well, it could be done both ways. We could have the trust agreement, and that if all we're talking about is who could live where and who's going to pay for things, and it just talks about a specific asset, then the trust agreement makes sense. But if we're going to broaden it, and the agreement between two people really talks more about, who's going to pay other utilities like food and travel expenses, and, not specifically pertaining to that property, then the cohabitation agreement probably makes sense. I typically defer people, especially couples, to go to the family attorneys first, right? Especially when we're talking about that prenup, postnup, or the cohabitation agreement, and then come to me. And then my plan kind of piggybacks on what they've already agreed to with the family attorney.
Makes sense. Okay. The other question that has always been posed to us is, well, if you're not married, then do you have the authority to sign a do not resuscitate, a DNR, that type of thing? And honestly, even though I do work in healthcare, that's always been one of those things that, is it handled by the hospital? Does it hold the same validity? Is that something that we should drop also outside?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, so those advanced directives, the power of attorney, the healthcare proxy, also the last will, by default, what they defer to is the next of kin. Okay, so if somebody doesn't have a healthcare proxy and there's a medical situation, then the next of kin is going to be the one that makes those decisions. Same thing with the power of attorney. If we don't have a power of attorney in place and a guardianship is necessary, then the next of kin is usually the best resource. And obviously the last will and testament, if we don't have that in place, then the court usually relies on the next of kin to be the person representative and for sure to be the beneficiary, right? So because you're not married, it's more important for people that aren't married to have those documents than the people that are married. Not to say that the documents aren't important. They're important for everyone. But for people that are married, the universe kind of takes care of them and fills in the
Right.
gap with spouse. And so it's not as mission critical. But when you're not married, then you have to go out of your way to kind of designate who's the person that could make financial decisions on your behalf, who's the person that could make those healthcare decisions. So it's even more important that we have those advanced directives, and obviously the last will, and just a comprehensive estate plan for people that are cohabitating that aren't married.
Which opens up the next can of worms. So let's say that I do designate my domestic partner, but obviously we're not married, and my accounts are my accounts and his accounts are his accounts. How, I hate to say this, I pass away, great, it's all done. But what if I'm medically challenged? I can't make decisions for myself. How does he get into my bank accounts to be able to take care of me?
Yeah, that's the power of attorney. So the power of
Okay.
attorney is designed to allow people that can't make financial decisions on their behalf to designate who could make those financial decisions for them. Unfortunately, in Florida and in most states, we don't have this springing power of attorney, meaning it doesn't jump into action when it's needed. That power of attorney goes into effect when we sign. So when we execute that document, whoever we designate has the authority to take it to the bank and take out all our money. But that's okay. We generally trust those people. That's why we put them in the document. It's the universe we don't trust. So these power of attorney documents, we want to be very careful with. We don't want to share them with too many people. We don't want to give them away. They've got the word power in it. So it's very, very powerful. But that would be the document that would allow your, partner to be able to manage your assets on your behalf. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. The next hurdle that we came across was when the Affordable Care Act came into play. We thought, oh, great, he works for another large corporation, and as I do, and we thought, well, let's just consolidate and let's just use, you put me on your insurance, or I put you on my insurance, and let's just work it out that way. Okay, great. So we said, actually around this time, because it's open enrollment. So we looked, and mine was more economical because we're a healthcare company. And so he and his then minor daughter went on my insurance. Okay, fantastic. Giselle plus family. Okay, great. I did not know that the IRS then gets involved. Mm-hmm. And I was socked with, I want to say it was like a $15,000 extra put into my W-2 because we were not married, because we were domestic partners. Now, really? This one, my brain exploded. Yeah. And then I started looking into it, and that is actually the way that the law is written at this time. Really? That, yes, ma'am. And so I'm like, oh my goodness, I've got to pay all of these thousands of dollars in taxes because I put my domestic partner on my insurance, because the way that that ACA is written, that the Affordable Care Act is written, if you are employed, you must take that employer's insurance. The only way that you cannot take is if you're not employed and if you are married.
Wow. I did not realize that. The government does have a vested interest in people getting married, having kids, buying a house, so they kind of create the rules to force you into those cultural norms, because from the government's perspective, we're saner and more stable and less likely to cause trouble if we're in that dynamic. So I'm not surprised, but that seems, so does your company allow you to have people that, a domestic partner per se? Because it wasn't, I worked for IBM for 18 years in the 90s because I'm 110. And IBM was one of the first companies to allow non-married people onto their benefits. And it was a big deal because, it was very progressive at the time. Mm-hmm. And it was intended specifically for same-sex marriages, which I was really proud of. So it's especially heartwarming to see that most companies now do offer that for non-married people. But it's unfortunate that the IRS hasn't kind of caught on with that, and made it less of a tax liability to do that.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah,
that one really, that one took me aback. And obviously we then went into our respective corners, and he took his
everybody.
insurance the following year and I did too, and that kind of thing. But the other thing that I wanted to make sure was, since we were talking about assets being, how do we as domestic partners, my assets, and correct me if I'm wrong, my assets should always be held, mind you, rental income, businesses that we have, LLCs that we have, as tenants in common. Is that correct?
Well, tenants in common means that each one of you owns a 50% interest. The problem with tenants in common is that there's no rights of survivorship. So if one of you passes away, we would have to probate your interest, right? So we have to be careful that, if your intention is for the asset to go to each other, then we do want it to be joint tenants with rights of survivorship. That way, each one of you owns 100% interest in that entity. And that's typical, when we have two people that are partners and they don't mind that when they pass away, it's going to go to each other.
Right. Well, in my case, Odelia, we have 4 kids with 4 different last names.
Okay.
I have 2 and he has 2. Pardon me. I lost my earpiece, my AirPod. So we have decided that we will not have rights of survivorship, that we, his 2 kids can deal with, let them figure it out, kind of thing, or we can buy each other out, that sort of thing. So we've decided to just split everything down the middle and do it that way. So in that case, then it would be tenants in common with no right of survivorship.
Right. So tenants in common does make sense, but you may want to hold your interest through a trust, right? So this would be different than the trust we talked about regarding a property, moving it into the trust with all the terms of the trust. This would be, you each have your own individual trusts, right? And you've got your beneficiaries and he's got his beneficiaries. And then you each hold your interest in that LLC or in that property as tenants in common, but not individually, through your own individual trusts. This way, God forbid you should pass away, we don't have a probate and the asset knows where to go.
Very, very interesting. Okay, so that's how that would be done.
Yeah. Ideally, obviously, not every asset is susceptible to that. But, when talking about LLCs, corporations, real property, a lot of times we could kind of fund the trusts that each individual has and make it make sense. Yeah.
Okay. The other myth, and this is also very personal. When we were teenagers, my poor dad passed away and my mom was left with 3 teenagers. But because my parents were married and my dad was an executive for Montgomery Ward, I don't even think anybody knows what that is anymore. They were the Jefferson stores down here. You do know. Okay, good. He was like an area vice president or something. So we, as back then, until we were done with college, and I believe now it's until the minor child is 18, we then received a portion of his Social Security to be able to get through life and everything. And the one myth that I find that young people that are not getting married and are doing the domestic partner thing, they don't realize what incredible exposure that is when they have children with their domestic partners and are not officially married. I believe that Social Security does not recognize those children. Am I right? Because that's a friend of mine. Yeah.
It's a bit of a problem when people aren't married and they have kids, in that obviously when you're married and you get divorced, you got to go through divorce court and then you deal with child custody issues. But when you're not married and you break up, all of a sudden you find yourself still in divorce court dealing with child custody issues without a divorce. So it's a little bit of a murky water when two people aren't married and then they have minor children in particular. When it comes to Social Security, sometimes they can show, on the death certificate or the birth certificate who the, parent was for that individual child. And then you could still claim some benefits through, even though they weren't, they weren't technically married. But yeah, it's a much bigger hurdle. And we see more of that nowadays because so many more kids teenagers are non-traditional and they don't really see the value in getting married, rightfully so. Again, it's an agreement with the state of Florida, so there's a lot of downside to it. But the government does, like I said, have an interest in kind of pushing us towards getting married and having those 2 kids and a dog and a house. So, the rules kind of lend themselves to favoring that kind of path and track. It does make it easier when people do get married and have minor children, for sure.
Okay, so I personally experienced that, and thank goodness we did well, and we all, went on to lead successful lives. But I see that a lot, and it actually happened to one of my nurses at the hospital. Her daughter, unfortunately, although he's a blessing, was preparing the wedding and suddenly, had a baby. And it's like, oh, well, we'll get married after the baby's born. And tragically, her fiance died in a car accident. And and she got nothing. She got
Wow.
nothing. Yeah, which was it was earth shattering for my nurse, who had to continue working to help her daughter out. In that vein, then I think I had one other question here. Let me see. Oh, okay. I had written everything down. Okay. How does
Well, while you look, I can talk
Yes,
a little bit about what domestic partnership, how it looks in Florida, because, I don't
please.
think we actually defined domestic partnership. We talked about marriage, but we could talk a little bit about domestic partnership in that it's not really a statute according to the Florida laws. It's mostly a concept created by the counties. And it was originally intended when Florida still didn't allow same-sex marriages for the counties specifically to allow people to kind of live in together and get the benefits, mostly the workers, the employees of the county, so that they could get the benefits of, from their partners. And it extended to several counties. And so still there is this notion of a formal domestic partnership that people could get through the counties, but it's not really state ordained. It's not a statute according to the Florida laws, which marriage is. Being legally married in Florida means that you've gone through the formalities of the Florida marriage, you're certified, and you got the application, and then you got the certificate, and now you are this person that is married, right?
Yes.
So there is this notion of a legal domestic partnership, but it's not in every county.
Oh, okay. I found my question. So in my situation, I had a more comfortable house, a better located house. So he moved into my house. And people tell me, well, he has claim to your house. And I have talked to several attorneys that have said, no, he does not have claim to your house.
He does not have a claim to your house.
Okay. And so much so that I made him sign a lease.
Yeah.
With open dates. So should things go south, I can just fill in my dates. And yes, he's been leasing for me for 20 years.
I love that. Yeah, the idea of homestead being your primary residence, and homestead is really 3 things in Florida. The first thing, it's a property tax deduction, right? So we all enjoy that. The second thing, it's creditor protection. So your homestead property, nobody can come after it. But the third thing that nobody talks about is the homestead property knows where to go when somebody passes away. So when you're married and you live in a property and it's homesteaded, when somebody passes away, whether their spouse is on the deed or not, the spouse is entitled to a life estate. But the caveat is you have to be legally married, right? So because you're not legally married, you're just domestic partners, that means that technically speaking, he doesn't have a claim against your homestead.
Oh, Very, very good. Thank you. Thank you for reassuring me on that one, because he does have his own home.
Yeah.
And I don't stake claim to his home, but it's just more convenient for us to live here. And people have tried to scare me with that one, because I will tell you, in my last short little marriage of 3 years, it was between 2002 and 2005. And I don't know if you remember what happened to home prices in Dade County at that time, but
Yeah.
they literally tripled.
Yeah.
And I almost lost my house.
Wow.
Because he just said, well, for the 3 years I've been there, the house has gone up maybe $400,000. So you have to give me $200,000.
Wow.
And I just said, oh, that means I have to sell the house. So somehow that doesn't sit right with me. It's my house,
Yeah.
kind of thing. Or I have to sell it, and I'm just going to have to move away, and you'll never see your son. And that's how I solved that one. But it was scary to think that I was going to lose my house. I think at the time I'd lived here for maybe 7 or 8 years. I've been in my house forever. And it was sort of like, wow, somebody who is married can do that to you in 3 short years. And can a domestic partner do the same thing to you? And it's comforting to know that they cannot.
No. Marriage is meaningful. Domestic partnership is as you define it, right? So you're defining your domestic partnership rules, and you guys get to decide, you get to live here for a year, but you got to pay this. And if we break up, I kick you out. That's included in your domestic partnership agreement. Whereas in a marriage, the state, and it makes sense when we think about the homestead rules, it's intended to protect women from their no good cheating husbands. Because back in the day, women weren't allowed to be on the deeds, right? So only men traditionally were on the property deeds. And then if they didn't leave it to their wives in the will, it could go to any Tom, Dick, and Harry. So the rules were intended that women couldn't be displaced once their husbands passed away. Right.
Good to know. Very good to know. Very, very good to know. Okay. Have I left anything out? I'm looking through my notes. We went over the health insurance. We went over the assets, the DNR, which is very, very important. Bankruptcies, again, nothing
doing.
Nothing to be shared. Okay. Question, credit cards.
Yeah. So again, credit cards, your sins are yours. So your debts are yours. You don't have to commingle your debts unless you open a joint credit card. Okay. And then it would be both of yours. But if you've got your own creditors and he's got his own creditors, then there shouldn't be any commingling.
Okay. So a lot of people do open a joint credit card when they're not married. And that, I think that could be a problem.
That's no bueno. Never mix your debt with someone else's debt, kind of like boundaries. Like, here's where my crazy ends and your crazy begins. Here's where my debt ends and your debt begins.
Okay, very good. Have I left anything out? Taxes.
Oh, taxes.
Taxes.
Now, typically, I do leave tax discussions to the tax professionals, the accountants, and the CPAs of the world. There's sometimes an advantage to getting married and filing taxes together, right? A lot of times you file single head of household anyway, So, but essentially, we in 2024 hardly ever let the tax tail wag the dog, meaning we rarely make decisions based on taxes in this time in history in our location. We kind of just let taxes be what they are, and we live our lives the way that we want to. I don't know of many people that have gotten married or not married, divorced based on taxes. So it's usually not a driver, but it sometimes makes sense to kind of run the numbers with an accountant to see what the tax liability would be if you got married versus divorced and vice versa. Yeah.
Okay. And then my last question, I think, is, so we had a very symbolic religious, sort of spiritual kind of thing on our 10th anniversary of meeting and that sort of thing. Do those types of ceremonies hold any water anywhere?
They're nice. I'd love to be invited, but that's about it. No.
Okay. Okay, that's what
You
I
get
thought.
presents, you have a party, but it's not
Exactly.
meaningful in that is a marriage. No, unless there's a license signed, and that's why when you even have like a religious situation and, you have the priest or the rabbi or the shaman or whoever kind of
Mhm.
doing their thing, at the very end, you sign a document. That's the marriage license, right?
Right.
So, in Florida, a notary could act as I could marry people, I could
Mhm.
officiate over a marriage. So you do need someone that's been ordained, or a notary to kind of sign off on that, certificate to say that these people have been married. So marriage is like a contract with the state of Florida. It's a real thing. That ceremony is nice, but not meaningful.
Mm. And I lied. This is actually my last question. Pardon me. So my daughter is getting married in 6 months. Yay!
Congratulations.
Thank you to a wonderful young man. It's about time. It's been 6 years already, right? They are doing what most young people do, which is do everything backwards. So they bought a house together. They live up in Alexandria, Virginia. They got the dog.
Hmm.
And God willing, everything goes great. And in 6 months, I'm calling you up and going, Odelia, they got married. This is great. Now we need to do their trust
Yeah.
because they own property, because they, that sort of thing. So just for my own, they are obviously domestic partners. For my own peace of mind, God forbid something should happen to either one of them. God forbid. What what is the course of action because they do own this property together?
Yeah, so it depends how they took title. Okay, if both of their names are on title, the words after their names are meaningful. If the words tenants in common exist, or if the words joint tenants with rights of survivorship, or if there's nothing after their name, that's meaningful. So when people tell me I own this property with this person, I'm like, I got to see the deed because I have to see the exact language. By default, they're going to own the property as tenants in common, which means they each own 50% interest, and we would have to probate the other person's 50%. So it would go either according to that person's will. If there is no will, it goes according to the Virginia statute, right? And Virginia statute is probably going to have it going to their parents.
Okay.
If they have the magical words, joint tenants with rights of survivorship, and that's the magical words, then that would mean that God forbid one of them passes away, it would go to the other one, right? So it depends what the deed says in how it's going to be treated. God forbid one of them should pass.
Then that's a very important point because I don't know how the deed is structured, and what little paperwork I've seen of theirs, there's nothing after it. Okay. Good
Send
to
it
know.
over. I'll take a look.
Oh, you're the best.
I'll take a look. I'll let you know in a few minutes.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think that's all I have for today.
Amazing, Giselle. Well, thank you for a wonderful conversation. I talk about marriage and what it means and how it works all day long. So this is a wonderful opportunity to kind of get it out there so that, if people have any questions, they can kind of have a resource. And I really appreciate you taking the time and putting together your list of questions for me. You kind of formulated a beautiful conversation.
Well, thank you, Odelia. Thank you for taking the time out to speak with me.
Amazing. Take care.
All righty. Bye-bye.
You've been tuning in to the Adulting Demystified podcast with your host, Odelia Goldberg. You should never get legal advice from a podcast. Please don't do anything stupid and ruin it for the rest of us. You deserve to have your own legal advice from a legal professional. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcast, Spotify, and on our website, oldgoldberglaw.com. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others.